The content of this podcast has not been evaluated by Health Canada or the FDA. It is educational in nature and should not be taken as medical advice. Always consult a qualified medical professional to see if a diet, lifestyle change, or supplement is right for you. Any supplements mentioned are not intended to diagnose, treat, cure, or prevent any disease. Please note that the opinions of the guests or hosts are their own and may not reflect those of Advanced Orthomolecular Research Incorporated. Welcome to Supplementing Health, a podcast presented by Advanced Orthomolecular Research. We are all about applying evidence-based and effective dietary, lifestyle, and natural health product strategies for your optimal health. In each episode, we will feature very engaging clinicians and experts from the world of functional and naturopathic medicine to help achieve our mission to empower people to live their best lives naturally. 2020 was a universally challenging year that left most of us feeling mentally and physically depleted. Essentially, we're all coping with an emotional hangover. Luckily, inositol helps regulate brain signaling systems that promote healthy mood balance. Research suggests high doses of inositol can address symptoms of behavioral and compulsive disorders, particularly those related to mood imbalances and worrying. Those suffering with poor regulation of blood sugar, PCOS, or mood disorders such as anxiety may benefit from inositol. Available in capsule and powder form for varied doses and therapeutic effects, you can get yours at your local retailer or online at aor.ca or aor.us. Welcome back to Supplementing Health. I'm excited to be introducing Dr. Casey Rosengriegel, naturopathic doctor. She has a practice in Golden, Colorado, where she focuses on endocrine balance, digestion complaints, immune dysregulation, and chronic inflammation. Today, we'll be discussing the relationship between hormones and anxiety. Welcome, Casey, and thanks for joining me.
Thanks so much for having me.
So when did you first become interested in hormones and the role they play in mental health?
Well, I've always really been fascinated by how hormones work, how they govern the function of all our organ systems, and how they all sort of work together to maintain homeostasis in the body. And specifically, when I went into naturopathic endocrinology, I love it because we have such effective tools to modify and improve the health of the endocrine organs, especially over time. And as a matter of course, when I see patients who have concerns with their hormones, often the first or most disruptive symptom they experience is changes in mood and mental health. So it all kind of goes together.
Are all forms of anxiety disorders or mood disorders affected by hormones?
Well, it depends on what you mean by hormones. A hormone's any signal that the body sends through the bloodstream that impacts many organ systems throughout the body. So cortisol fits there, thyroid, reproductive hormones. To differentiate, a neurotransmitter is a sort of a specialized type of hormone that only travels along neural pathways, and it just impacts the nervous system. So it's sort of a special type of hormone. Most anxiety has some involvement with our stress hormones like cortisol and the neurotransmitter epinephrine, or sometimes we call that adrenaline. But other neurotransmitters and hormones can definitely also impact mood. Though if you're looking for a specific type of hormone, it's not necessarily one thing that's always causing the issue.
Do our sex hormones play a role in it as well, like our estrogen, progesterone, those sorts of hormones?
Absolutely. You know, when I teach my course on women's endocrine health, we talk about the hormones being sort of like a symphony. We have our brain that governs the production of primarily things like thyroid, reproductive hormones, and adrenal hormones, and they all work together to create balance in the body. And so all of those can, if they get disrupted, contribute to anxiety.
And do you see more of a specific type of anxiety in your practice over others?
So in my practice, the anxiety disorders that I tend to see tend to be more often associated with endocrinology issues and our hormone balance, because that's what I specialize in.
Do you find they go hand in hand with other mental health issues as well?
They can, not always, but you know, sometimes someone will feel like they've had a lifetime of feeling completely balanced, and then all of a sudden they get to a time of life and either there's a ton of stress or there's a big shift in their own hormones. Maybe it's postpartum, maybe it's premenopause, maybe there's a death in the family, and then all of a sudden they, because of that shift, they're experiencing anxiety. So that can happen too.
Okay. So we know that progesterone stimulates the part of the brain that's responsible for our fight or flight response. Uh, but many people don't realize that progesterone dominance can actually lead to similar symptoms as estrogen insufficiency. So could this imbalance lead to symptoms of anxiety as well then?
It can potentially. I'll tell you clinically, um, it's not actually that simple. So clinically, I don't see progesterone dominance anywhere near as frequently as I see estrogen dominance, and that has a lot to do with just how our bodies produce our estrogen and progesterone. Also, there's another piece that I think is really important to note, which is that it's not just how much of a hormone that you have in your body. Progesterone dominance certainly could play out as looking at anxiety, but it's a really complex interplay between genetics, hormones, stressors, and then your own internal environment. So, for instance, there's some interesting research right now showing a metabolite of progesterone that's called allopregnanolone, and that works in the CNS, the central nervous system, to modify GABA receptors. And what we're seeing is that with that GABA receptor response, it's actually dose dependent. So it can either improve or decrease the mood. So it does actually tend to be a little more fine-tuned than just one or the other causing something.
Oh, that's interesting. So then why is it that estrogen tends to be more prevalent, like the issues with estrogen?
Well, so estrogen is known as being more relaxing to the mind. And in terms of why estrogen dominance is a little more prominent, that has more to do with the way that our ovaries produce estrogen and progesterone, especially as we head towards menopause. The production of progesterone is very dependent upon the quality of the egg and the follicle that our ovary produces. And so a lot of times we'll be able to make estrogen in a really robust way while the quality of that that follicle is falling, and so progesterone does tend to fall first. Yeah, so so again, estrogen has been known to be relaxing to the mind. So so that association between estrogen and anxiety certainly can happen. But just like with progesterone, there are also more layers. One of the areas of research right now is looking at different types of estrogen receptors and their impact on mood. So there's alpha receptors and beta receptors and some other types of receptors they're actually finding as well. The beta receptors are finding, they're finding that they are more associated with that sort of relaxation. So when we're using more of the beta receptor, there's more relaxation. And then another layer is looking at the role of different genetic subtypes of estrogen receptors. So different genetic subtypes will express and influence a person's susceptibility to depression and anxiety. So again, it's not just like high or low estrogen, it's what your body is doing, it's how your receptors are receiving the estrogen, and it's your own genetic predisposition.
Does the methylation of the estrogen in the different types, whether it's like estradiol, like parent estrogen, or any of the breakdowns also play into that then?
That's an interesting question. I know that some of those estrogenic breakdown products can be more stimulatory than the estrogen itself. So I think that there is a theory that if you aren't clearing your estrogen breakdown products appropriately, you may have different symptoms that manifest in different ways. And we certainly see that with different types of other types of issues that I might treat, things like, heavy periods or other types of menopausal symptoms that come up. So sometimes that clearance is actually a very crucial piece.
Okay, so now for men, estrogen doesn't play the same role within their body systems that it does for women. So would low levels of testosterone or excess testosterone present in a similar way that estrogen does for women?
Well, so Yeah, I mean, we definitely see much, much lower production of estrogen in men, although estrogen is produced in the peripheral tissues from testosterone in men. But what we also see is that, in the literature, testosterone is shown to have a protective effect against anxiety and depression, and lower levels of serum testosterone are associated with more depressive type symptoms.
Do you find that depending on what type of testing you're using, you'll get a different picture, like whether you're doing, say, blood testing and looking at serum levels or looking at, say, a saliva hormone test?
I do. I do tend, especially when we're looking at things like, I think there's the best data out there is about cortisol, but I also do like looking at some of the saliva profiles for uh, the other reproductive steroid hormones. And the reason for this is that generally when we look at serum samples, blood samples that is, we look at a total hormone level. And generally with most of our hormones, about 99% of the production that we have in our body is going to be bound to some sort of other protein in the blood. And so it circulates through the body, but is bound and cannot be used. And usually somewhere under 1% of the amount that we're actually producing is unbound and free. And so when we look at saliva samples, we actually get a better idea about what is actually free and available, because we're looking at free hormone levels in the saliva sample. So I do tend to like seeing those. Although, whatever we can get, if we can get some data, it's always a good place to start.
Yeah, absolutely. Now you were talking about testosterone and it can have a protective effect in mental health. Is that correct?
Mm-hmm.
So what exactly is it that what is its role in creating that protective effect, or how does that come about?
Sure. So one of the theories is that testosterone actually augments the production of serotonin and GABA in the brain. And those two are what we would call some of our primary inhibitory neurotransmitters. Those are the neurotransmitters that tell our brain to sort of shut down, relax, and not be so vigilant. And so if we can, activate those more, we tend to feel calmer.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. And stress hormones, such as cortisol, we've talked about those a few times already throughout our conversation, but they're released in situations where we feel threatened, out of control, overwhelmed, just stress in general, which seem to come up more often in today's day and age than it did for our ancestors. So people are getting excess excretion and more consistent excretions of cortisol. So how can someone work on lowering their cortisol levels so that they're not creating those anxious feelings on such a regular basis?
Right. So that's a great question. And one of the things that I always like to explain to my patients is just to talk a little bit physiologically about what happens when we experience stress. And just like you said, so the way that we express or experience stress today is pretty different than the way that we experience stress historically. Historically, it meant escape from danger, run from the bear. So our stress hormones help us prepare to escape danger. That means it helps us to think fast, run fast, pump blood quickly to your brain, to your muscles, and then supply them with glucose or blood sugar to power your escape. So cortisol is the part of that hormone cascade that mobilizes the blood sugar so you can run your brain, run your heart, run your muscles, and escape danger. So today, generally, we are not actually physically moving when we experience stress. Stress takes on a whole different thing, but physiologically, the same thing is still happening. So when we experience stress, we still make all this stuff and it still feels like anxiety, particularly when we're not using all that extra blood sugar that we just mobilized. So when we want to manage cortisol, we have a variety of options. And of course, the first place to start is to do all the good lifestyle stuff that you know, right? Exercise, meditate, deep breathe, yoga, all those things that actively decrease your stress response, all those things that we know that we can do. And then another really critical piece for me is that cortisol has a second job. It doesn't just kick in when we have stress. Cortisol kicks in when our blood sugar gets too low for the very same reason. If our blood sugar gets too low, say it's been 8 hours since we ate, then our brain still needs to function. And so cortisol kicks in and gives us more sugar. So one thing I see really frequently with anxiety and with a lot of my patients is that they wake up at 3 in the morning. So for instance, if you ate dinner at 7, by 3 it's been 8 hours, and your blood sugar has gotten so low that cortisol kicks in, particularly if you already have a little bit of a trigger happy stress response. So one thing I tell a lot of folks is a small protein snack before bed will often keep the blood sugar much more stable throughout the night and will help to sleep through the night. And generally, overall, balancing our blood sugar is really critical for managing stress and anxiety. And then there's a whole range of other types of things I use to help to manage stress and cortisol, but those are my favorite sort of lifestyle tips.
And do you find that trendy diets or eating patterns, such as things like intermittent fasting, keto, can also have an effect on people's cortisol levels or that reaction that they're having where they are waking up at 3 a.m. or, are overstimulated?
Again, I think a lot of it really comes down to blood sugar. If some people tolerate intermittent fasting just fine, some people really don't. It's very individual. And so, yeah, if you're eating dinner at 5 o'clock and you don't want to eat again until 9 a.m. the next day, some people don't do well with that. And so by 4 in the morning, it's been 11 hours and they're up. Keto diets are a little bit different in that you're engaging different parts of your metabolism, but again, it also can be somewhat challenging to keep that blood sugar regulated with any of those more extreme type of choices.
Earlier in our conversation, you mentioned that thyroid can play a role in anxiety, and when it presents with physical symptoms, sometimes it can be things such as heart rate, palpitation, shakiness, increased sweating, which people associate with anxiety. So, what about the thyroid function leads to this presentation?
Yeah, so in a general way, the thyroid sort of sets the rate at which your body functions. Again, it's, how fast you digest your food, how fast you metabolize, how fast you pump your blood, how fast you make new cells. So I like to think of your thyroid kind of like your thermostat. If you're pumping things up, they go faster. If you bring things down, they go slower. And that feeling of your body going faster than it needs to in all those levels certainly can feel like anxiety. I will mention though that low thyroid also can manifest as other types of mental disturbance. You can have the insomnia or the depression or the fatigue. And so it kind of can go either way in terms of the thyroid.
Okay, so what are some of the other signs of hormone imbalance that people should be looking out for if they're thinking, hey, some of this sounds like me and maybe I should consider hormone treatments?
Yeah, so some of the most common symptoms I see in hormone imbalances are shifts in weight, shifts in energy, hair loss, emotional changes, libido, of course, obvious things like hot flashes and night sweats, anything that seems to be impacting your whole system that you're not quite sure. Although sometimes I'll just have people come to me and their hair's falling out and they don't know why. Or sometimes people will come to me and they just have one thing happening. It can manifest just as one, but a lot of times if you're feeling like you're having things happen in multiple systems, that's a good time to get your hormones checked.
And are there ways that people can kind of assess which hormones are likely triggering their symptoms so they know who kind of to seek help from?
The best way to know what's going on with your hormones is you need to test them. And a lot of times the symptoms that you may experience between one type of hormone imbalance and another may overlap. And so for me, when I see patients, I like to make sure that their thyroid and their reproductive and their adrenal hormones are all working properly, because it is not uncommon when one goes that the others will follow. So sometimes we have to work with multiple systems.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. The body's very intertwined. So, do you find bioidentical hormone replacement therapy helps in the treatment of anxiety or some of these other mood disturbances like sleep or insomnia, et cetera, that you've mentioned previously?
Yeah, so I don't think of bioidentical hormones as a first line treatment for anxiety, but it certainly can play a role when people's reproductive hormones are out of balance. We have a lot of really good options for managing anxiety and managing hormone levels, both reproductive and otherwise. But for people who it is appropriate, we certainly can utilize bioidenticals and they can work well.
And are there specific nutrients that you find are important in the treatment protocols when dealing with anxiety?
So for my patients, as I've sort of already harped upon, I always like to start with lab work to see if you're actually deficient in anything, and then we can work from there. In terms of specifics, if you're concerned about not making enough steroid hormones or thyroids, I start with the very basics. One, make sure you have enough cholesterol in your body to make steroid hormones and protein to make thyroid and adrenal hormones. Especially when people are choosing animal-free or very restrictive diets, or they're taking cholesterol-lowering medication, you can deprive yourself of necessary, just basic macronutrients to make those hormones. So that's first. B vitamin complexes are helpful because they just provide cofactors to make healthy adrenal hormones. And things like, depending on if we're supporting something like the thyroid, we might, look at things like iodine or tyrosine. Vitamin B12 tends to help reset the circadian rhythm in the body, which is very helpful if insomnia is a piece. There's some literature out there that's indicating vitamin D can also help with optimal adrenal function. Also, if we're having an adrenal issue, I often will look at electrolytes such as magnesium and calcium, just to make sure that we're balancing the corticosteroid piece of things.
Okay, and can we circle back to cholesterol for a second? Because I know it gets a bad rap. Most people, when you say cholesterol, they're thinking, um, heart attack or heart stroke, things like that, that it gets such a negative connotation. But cholesterol actually plays a really important role in our overall health at proper levels and balanced with everything else going on. So can you speak to a little bit about the cholesterol roles and things people should be considering when the word cholesterol is said?
Absolutely. Cholesterol is, as you say, so critical to our overall health and well-being. And cholesterol is implicated in cardiovascular health, and we want it to be balanced, absolutely. But one of the keys that I have people look for is, if we do total cholesterol count, for instance, we want to make sure that those HDLs are nice and high. And if the total cholesterol is getting down below 160, and you're having symptoms of hormone issues, then we certainly look to that as a potential for needing to replenish cholesterol stores. And our body can synthesize cholesterol from starches, but we use it most optimally from animal products. So, it's all about the balance. It's all about your personal choices and what works for you.
Okay, so there's therapy options and treatments that are available that aren't directly assessing the hormone imbalance, but can help with anxiety. So, for example, one of those would be like animal therapy. It's fairly well known that for lots of people, cuddling their pets or playing with animals, it brings joy, puts a smile on their face, etc. So, is there a scientific explanation for this calming effect that it provides? And can it help to address the hormone imbalance that is at the base if they address it from a more topical level like that?
Sure. So the way that I like to look at a lot of this is we look at what we call the autonomic nervous system. The autonomic nervous system is the two parts of our what we would call automatic nervous system, either the part that helps us to rest and digest our food and to repair, or the part that is more that fight or flight or that stress piece. Now, when we're in fight or flight, when we're in that sympathetic mode, it's going to shut down all of our rest and repair mechanisms. Fight or flight always wins. And when our brain perceives that we are in that sense of fight or flight, it's not going to be as effective at appropriately making all of our different hormones at the same time. All of those hormones are made in our hypothalamus in our brain, so they're very affected by our thoughts and our moods. And so the more that we can engage our parasympathetic, the more that we can engage, loving time, especially with snuggling a pet. There's no better way to get the parasympathetic working again.
And so that would be a similar sort of effect that like therapies such as cognitive behavioral therapy would have, correct? Like where you start addressing that negative self-talk or negative thought loops that can occur, that would also be addressing that parasympathetic system then?
Yeah, I mean, ultimately our hormone production is governed by our hypothalamus, or our what we call the master gland in the brain. And so the more we're able to work through, rewire old thought patterns and introduce new healthy ones, the more we're going to be able to theoretically balance the production of our hormones.
Awesome. And so if multiple hormones can contribute to the symptoms of anxiety, can this not sometimes result in a somewhat vicious cycle? So, just as an example, if your initial symptom was a result of low estrogen or testosterone, and then cortisol takes over when you're already feeling anxious, can that not kind of create you on a bit of a downward spiral?
Yeah, I mean, as I mentioned earlier, all of our hormones they're just one element in the big symphony, and your brain is the conductor. So there has to be an overall balance for us to achieve optimal wellness. So that's why I like to look at all the different hormone systems. And when we're talking about anxiety, it can absolutely be self-perpetuating, and because it is definitely fed by these multiple systems. So one example is when we experience chronic unmitigated stress, our excitatory neurotransmitters like glutamate and epinephrine, they're going all the time. And then that causes excess production of cortisol outside the boundaries of that normal circadian rhythm. And then that disrupts sleep. And then that stresses the thyroid. And then when the thyroid production changes, it disrupts the balance between estrogen and progesterone. And yes, it all just kind of snowballs from there.
On that note, if someone wanted to work with you and they're experiencing the symptoms, how would they go about getting in touch with you?
So people are welcome to go to my website. I'm at goldenholisticmedicine.com. And I'm always happy to book appointments with folks. And I also run what's called the Women's Hormone Health Masterclass. And that's something where we meet once a month, and each month we talk about new hormones and the way that they impact our bodies. And we talk about all the ways that we can really take charge and be really empowered of our own health into menopause and beyond. So that's also a really fun group to be a part of.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much, Casey. This has been an absolutely enlightening conversation, and I really appreciate you taking the time to come and chat with me.
Cassie, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you for listening to Supplementing Health. For more information about our guests, past shows, and future topics, please visit aor.ca/podcast or aor.us/podcast. Do you have a topic you want us to cover? We invite you to engage with us on social media to request a future topic or email us at marketing@aor.ca.